Making a sequel is not easy. While you don't have to come up with something completely new, you run into the issue of trying to figure out how to make something that's the same but different enough to be justified. And when it comes to making movies, it's a lot easier than making a game. A movie only has to run between an hour and a half and 3 hours and continue a story or tell a new one with the same characters while maintaining a tone. Sometimes a sequel is so good you forget that there ever was a first one to begin with, like Terminator 2 or The Dark Knight. Sometimes a sequel is just as good as the previous, like with The Godfather or John Wick. But most of the time you end up with an inferior sequel, and that's such a vast ocean of options to pick from that I'm not even going to bother doing that. There's a lot of aspects that make a sequel good or bad, and it's different in a case-by-case basis. And in gaming, this is something that will leave people at times more divided than a movie ever could. Depending on genre, era of gaming, or even just the audience can determine how a sequel will do. And unlike a movie, which can take like a year and a half to make a decent one of, a decent game can take 2 to 5 years. Unless we're talking about Obsidian Entertainment making Fallout New Vegas, creating one of the best and most well-written RPGs of all time in a year and a half using a lot of reused assets, but they are, and I can't put this lightly, a special case. Usually in gaming there are two main groups of people when it comes to a sequel. Those that want the same but more, and those that want something different but similar in other aspects like tone or style. Frostpunk 2 firmly sits in that second category. Frostpunk 2 is what I would call a logical sequel. How do you make a sequel to a city survival simulator? By witnessing the next step in the city's history. To do this, we advance 30 years to see how the small city of New London, with a population of no more than 700 people from the first game's main story, has now expanded. Now with thousands of people and growing exponentially, you take over from where your previous self left off. I think this makes the most sense. The only other option I see, let me know if you think of something better, is that Frostpunk 2 could have taken place in another part of the world. And to be honest, I wouldn't mind seeing that. Like imagine Frostpunk but like in Germany or Italy or even in North America or Asia. But then the game might have ended up being a bit too similar to Frostpunk 1, and that would have been a problem in itself for a lot of other players. Especially in an era of gaming like now, where instead of having to make an entire new game to add a few features, we can just update it. And with how different these two games are in certain aspects, there's nothing stopping 11-bit from going back and adding more DLC to Frostpunk 1. Not that that's a common practice for developers to do, but it would be cool to see that finally. Instead, 11-bit decided that the best course of action is to maintain the tone and atmosphere from Frostpunk 1 and let us experience the next part in New London's story, expansion. In Frostpunk 1, you are tasked to ensure the city's survival, but in Frostpunk 2, you also have to thrive despite the seemingly endless winter you're in. Instead of individual buildings, there are now districts with their own generator. Instead of two ideologies to choose from, there are now multiple factions with their own. Instead of one whiteout, there will be multiple. And instead of maintaining a small colony, you now have multiple large ones. While gameplay-wise, yes, it is different, yet it's very similar. Its tone is basically the same bleak game as before, complete with child labor. Because without it, it just wouldn't be Frostpunk now, would it? As a result of this change, there are new things to keep track and maintain. You will never not have something to do. If you thought Frostpunk 1 was good at keeping you busy, let me tell you, Frostpunk 2 cranks that up. Now you have to deal with things like faction relations, 3 different energy sources, multiple settlements, raiders, whiteouts, prefabs, heatstamps, food, housing, disease, squalor, crime, materials, goods, scouts and their dangerous environments they will be exploring, research, and radical solutions. And get used to hearing me say radical a lot like it's the 90s, because you'll have to deal with 2 radicalized factions known as the Pilgrims and the Stalwarts. Not to mention their less radicalized forms, the Frostlanders and the New Londoners. These 4 factions are the different ideologies you'll have to deal with in Frostpunk 2, and unlike Tropico, these don't like being ignored. You want a civil war? Because that's how you get one.
But wait! There's more!
These are just the factions that you have in the story. In the Utopia Builder, which is this game's endless mode, adds several different ones that aren't in the story, and that really adds replayability to Endless. You'll have factions like the Bohemians, who are looking to move the city towards adaptation, equality, and reason, and they're the opposition of the Overseers. Or maybe you're more like the Ventures, who are looking to move the city closer to progress, merit, and reason, and they're the opposite of the Menders. Or maybe you're the Lords, like the ones from the first games, who didn't learn their lesson the last time.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
Now, a lot of people don't seem to like the addition of these factions, but I think they add a lot to the game. Not just in a gameplay perspective, but also a narrative one, and a logical one at that. Before, in Frostpunk 1, you were the leader of less than 1,000 people. You were there to make the hard decisions for everyone. But now that there's thousands and thousands of them with different ideologies, it's logical that they're gonna break off into different groups. I mean, this is just modern day politics. And from a gameplay perspective, they affect the game in many different ways. For instance, when you want to research something, you have to pick a faction to do the research. And depending on which one you have do the research will give you a different result. Not to mention, having them do the research also improves your relationship with them. And you're not locked into whatever they researched. You can have both groups do the same thing, allowing you to have two different buildings to use whenever you find appropriate. I feel like this adds a lot of decision making to research, giving it much more depth. On top of that, it effectively doubles the size of the research tree, which is already rather large. You research things like hubs, which can affect the buildings surrounding them. You also research building upgrades that you can build in districts to boost things like efficiency or produce extra resources. And I feel like this is a great way to handle research. A lot of games will have it where you have to re-research or rediscover something that you had in the previous game. But since this is a continuation, you already have that stuff researched. This is new stuff that you're adding on top of that. And something new added to research this time around is the ability to research laws that you can pass. Oh yeah, that's another thing that Frostpunk 2 does differently. Laws. Passing laws in Frostpunk 2 requires a council to vote on it. And you can even negotiate and bribe to have laws voted for or against, including radical laws like Apex Workers, which makes workers not care about the cold, which boosts productivity. However, this can lead to a loss of workers.
I love democracy.
The voters are members of the different factions, and this is one of the areas that the faction's opinion of you matters, as well as their size. The more members that are a part of that faction, the more representation they get in the council. The more they like you, the more likely they are to vote for something you want, even if it's things that will eventually cause them to not have any power and you can rule over everyone with an iron fist.
I love the Republic.
Not only that, but the radicalized groups will grant you bonuses when they idolize you, and you don't have to pick a side. You can make both sides happy, and this is one of my favorite aspects in Frostpunk 2. See, the factions want you to do things that align with their ideals, and if you're like me, you'll find one side that you really like in the beginning and slowly start to realize that the other radical group that you wanted to get rid of initially actually has some things that are better than the side that you like. Like in the story, I liked the stalwarts at first, but later on, I found myself having the pilgrims do most of the research despite their tendency to huff gas fumes. Yeah, that one might have been a red flag, especially what ends up happening in the last chapter of the story. Oh, Frostpunk never change. Weirdly enough, I was still doing things that the stalwarts liked. I never felt limited by these factions like I do in a game like Tropico. I swear I do like Tropico a lot. It is actually one of my favorite city builders, but I cannot get all those groups to like me at the same time. The other benefit of having factions like you is that they'll end up having special abilities, or you can just ask them for Heatstamps, which is this game's currency. This is another point of contention that I've seen in reviews, that because it's an apocalypse, money shouldn't be a thing. Yeah, that would be weird, right? Almost as if people can be selfish and greedy to a fault and aid in the collapse of civilization as we know it. Weird, huh? To be fair, this isn't something that kind of comes out of left field. There were signs of this in Frostpunk 1. For instance, the lords in the refugee scenario, which were the rich from before the Great Winter. And you learn in Last Autumn that there's a war going on, despite being well aware that they're approaching an apocalyptic scenario. And now that your small settlement has expanded to a civilization, it's reasonable to believe that people would like to have more of a normal life. And in order to do that, they want goods to purchase to own for themselves. As a result, you now have to manufacture goods to keep them happy and keep them motivated. The more motivated they are, the better your workers are going to be. And unlike before, not everyone in your population can work. Now, if people are sick or too old, they're not going to be able to work. And while in Frostpunk 1, this is something that would really be frustrating, in Frostpunk 2, it once again again makes a lot of sense. Now that you have a much larger population, the ability for people to have a proper retirement or get the rest they need to recover for medical reasons makes a lot of sense. Where before, having just one person not be able to go to work could be life or death for these people, now if Henry is too sick to work, we'll just get another person to take this shift. The world of Frostpunk has now expanded. I mean, even the way you count time is different. In Frostpunk 1, you count the hours and days, but in Frostpunk 2, you're looking at the game's timeline in days and weeks.
Unless you zoom in into each district,
You can't even properly see the individuals in the game, and while some have a problem with this, I think it adds to the game's tone.
the only ones you can really learn a lot about are the ones that are on the council. You're a politician. You can only interact with other politicians, which only furthers the disconnect that you can get in this game.
These people can't be spotted walking around like they are in Frostpunk 1. As a result of this, you can't grow as easily attached to them. There's too many of them, and sometimes not enough of them are working. And you know what that means? You get disconnected. They feel more like a resource, a tool, a number. They're dehumanized in a way, and while that would reduce the impact of something like child labor, this game is constantly prompting you with how your decisions have impacted the lives of various people, giving them a face, a name, age, and faction. You'll never fully get away from the horrors that they're going through. God, I love Frostpunk. While some see this as a negative, I see this as a strong positive. It makes it feel like there is no one answer on how to play this game. You can become a totalitarian leader or a man of the people, leading New London against the eternal winter. And I think that leads me into my last few arguments promoting Frostpunk 2. The first being heat. In Frostpunk 1, you have to manage the heat in every individual building. And while in a small city builder, this is perfect, giving you a heat map to see every building's heat level and having them huddle around a generator, like a group of people huddling around a small fire, this is something that's mostly absent in Frostpunk 2. And I know that sounds like a negative, and admittedly, I am disappointed about that. It was a very unique mechanic that I loved, but I both understand and love the district mechanic for other reasons. I understand this from a story standpoint. Why wouldn't they build more generators to be able to not have to solely rely on a single generator? As we've seen in the refugee scenario, the population expanding is going to make it difficult to huddle around that generator. And steam hubs are the logical first step to building another generator, right? I also understand this from a development standpoint. It simplifies the already complex game. However, the idea of building smaller generators and having to place buildings around them like steam hubs in the first game does sound pretty fun. However, the district mechanic is enjoyable because of some of the rules and bonuses that come with it. There is still a logic that you have to use when it comes to placing down your buildings like in Frostpunk 1. For instance, if you want to place down a housing district by another housing district or a food district, it reduces the amount of heat required by all those districts. However, if you place them next to something like an extraction district, industrial district, or logistics district, it increases squalor, which is this game's discontent. And as someone who has been dealing with construction going on outside his window for the last 2 months, I can tell you it'll affect your mental health negatively. And the same rule about this applies to other districts too. This is also where hubs can be beneficial, providing buffs to districts that they're near, like increasing productivity or reducing the amount of workforce you need. The building and planning in Frostpunk 2 has a lot of depth to it, but it doesn't feel too limiting. I like that. I like this game. Am I sad that there's no heat map to show me the heat levels of every area? Yes, but we have moved beyond that as a problem. Now, in order to maintain heat, we need to just supply the generators with enough fuel, or find other ways to provide some form of insulation, while also being able to sustainably provide enough materials for the maintenance costs. I think this district's mechanic deserves more credit than what Steam users are currently giving it. Unlike a lot of sequels that have been coming out in recent years, Frostpunk 2 is a game that gives you a lot to work with on launch. Sure, there's currently only one story and the Utopia builder, but a lot more depth has been added to both of those modes to make them last you longer, to give you a lot more replay value out of them. And I'm sure in the future they're going to add more stories and modes, and I can't wait to see those when they come out. The game has only been out for about 2 months at this point, and there's already a decent amount of content here to keep you going. There's so many things to keep track of. I'd honestly recommend having a friend join you as a second pair of eyes, like when you try out Frostpunk 1 for the first time. Great work, 11-Bit. Can't wait to see what traumatic experiences I get to subject the people of this city to in the future. You are the Steam Workshop that you open so that way people can make maps and scenarios for the game. And if you want to help me experience those and maybe even talk about them in the future or stream them, let me know what you think of Frostpunk 2 in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you're looking for a new pair of glasses, check out my Zenny link in the description or this weird thing in the corner for a 10% discount on your purchase. Until next time, I've been CabooseDOTexe, and remember to stay warm this winter, drink plenty of water, and I love you! Bye-bye.